Hey folks, David Stewart here. Disney Star Wars is not official Star Wars. Disney Star Wars is not canon. It's fan fiction. It's time to put it all together. Everything that I've been talking about lately, really the last couple of years, if you go back and watch older videos on this particular subject. No, nothing that Disney releases is official canon, and I'm going to hopefully convince you of that. Now, before I get to Star Wars, I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine you've saved up some money and you bought a ticket to go see Metallica, the Legends, live. You haven't seen them yet. You're so excited. You got to finally scrape some money together, maybe $100, and go see Metallica live. You get your ticket, you go to the arena, you find your seat. Lights start to go down after the opening act plays. You start hearing Ecstasy of Gold. Oh, you start hearing the intro to one of your favorite songs. Maybe it's like Battery or Inner Sandman or something. And the band comes out and starts playing. And you start scratching your head because you're like, they look different than their pictures on the website. Maybe they cut their hair or something, like in the 90s. You look a little closer. And then the singer starts singing and you realize it's not James Hetfield. You look close, you're like, that's not James Hetfield. What happened? And as you look closer, maybe you get your opera glasses out and you look. This band is not Metallica. There's no one in the band there's no Kirk Hammett, there's no Lars Ulrich, no James Hetfield, no one in the band that you're used to seeing, no Rob Trujillo. And so you're like, what's going on? You go to the promoter and you're like, I paid to see Metallica and there's some other band on stage. What's going on? And they're like, well, that's Metallica. And you'd say, no, it's not. And I think the average consumer would look at that and say, that is not Metallica. That can't be Metallica. Because Metallica is the people that are in Metallica. And so this example is a basic analogy proof of what I call trademark. Now, whenever I talk about intellectual property, a lot of people that watch get confused, I think, between me talking about the concept, which is what I'm going to be talking about in this particular video, and me talking about the legal execution of such ideas such as trademark, copyright, and patent. I'm not talking about the way that the law actually executes these or the way it's figured out in court. I'm talking about the concept because the law is there to reflect certain concepts. So this basic concept is that Metallica is made up of the artists which are in Metallica. You can't separate the trademark from the people who are in it in this particular case. And I would actually say in virtually all cases you can't separate them. I think people have been trained to think of them as separate, but I don't think you actually can. There's some fuzzy edges here with Metallica, right? The trademark of Metallica. Who is Metallica? Well, we've had different people in the band over the past almost 40 years at this point, because you had, Ron McGovney, the original bass player. Of course, he quit. Dave Mustaine was kicked out. So now you're at 50% of the original artists. And then you've had Cliff Burton who died. You've had Jason Newsted who quit. Of course, Kirk's been in the band since 1983, so that's a long continuation of three artists that make up Metallica. And then, of course, Rob Trujillo's been in the band now for quite some time, like 15 years. So at what point does Metallica stop being Metallica? Well, at the very least, you're going to expect James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich to be in the band. If those two aren't in the band, is it really Metallica anymore? And if none of those guys are in the band, it's definitely not Metallica. So you have a clear black section and a clear white section, and maybe the very slightest hint of gray where it crosses over. It's like, what do you have Lars in the band and not James? It doesn't sound right. It's not really Metallica. James is like the main guy who writes most of the music. You might have a very sliver of gray there, but in reality, most of the time it's black and white. You wouldn't expect, say, Judas Priest to call itself Judas Priest if there was no members that you're used to seeing in Judas Priest left in the band. In fact, I think the only original member that still tours is Ian Hill. I think Rob Halford was not the original singer, and he actually spent some time out of the band, where you had Ripper Owens doing vocals for a couple of albums, I think. And then he's been back in the band. KK Downing left the band, although I think he's a legal member, one of the original members. And Glenn Tipton can't tour anymore because he has Parkinson's, though he participates in recording. So what you see on stage with Judas Priest is some gray fraction of what you might consider the classic lineup. But you might still say, oh, I know that that's Judas Priest. They're upfront with it. What if we go back to Metallica and you go to the tour promoter and you're like, hey, that's not Metallica. And they're like, that is Metallica. Those four guys paid Metallica for the rights to perform as Metallica. They bought the trademark of Metallica from Metallica. You as a consumer would probably say, well, that's not Metallica. It doesn't matter what the legal finagling happened, what contractual signing off of rights happened. That isn't Metallica, and it can never be Metallica. And in fact, if you were to sue for false advertising, you might actually have a case, despite the fact that the current group known as Metallica has transferred their ownership. At the very least, like, the court might order them to do corrective advertising and say, we are now, to inform consumers that this version of Metallica contains a separate set of artists from the other set of artists that made up Metallica, because consumers expect Metallica to be those four guys. So I think there might actually be even a legal case. Who knows? This has never really happened with bands because there's no social acceptance for bands continuing without key members or without any members remaining. Even something like, I think the Beach Boys went on without Brian Wilson. That's one of those little gray areas. It's like, well, there's still original guys, but not Brian Wilson, And I think there was a conflict, John Fogerty and Creedence Clearwater Revival, where they were suing him for playing his own songs that he wrote for their, just a complete clown world when you actually get some of these things in the court. But you're going back to this social proof, this social idea that people understand that Metallica means those four guys. Now, what does this mean for Star Wars? Well, Star Wars is a lot more complicated. There's a lot more fuzzy edges, simply because when you make a movie, there's so many more people involved in the making of that product than with an album. You have not just the director, you have a screenwriter, you have producers, executive producers, you have visual artists like Ralph McQuarrie who design the set pieces, design the costumes, you have special effects supervisors, you have people working on the special effects, you have composers like John Williams, you have producers like Gary Kurtz. A lot of these people have gone from the crew that makes Star Wars, and then of course you have the actors. A lot of these people have disappeared from the crew that has made Star Wars over the years. So how many of them are required for them to have, Star Wars be Star Wars? Well, the hint, I think, is actually in the movies themselves. I think they actually admit this subtly, though people don't necessarily interpret this as such. When the credits roll, when you see Force Awakens, it says, based on the characters, at the end of the movie, based on characters created by George Lucas. Based on, meaning it's not official. They don't actually own those characters in a metaphysical sense. They can't, because they're creations of George Lucas, and you actually cannot separate creator and creation. It's like separating God and his creation. When you create something, you're like the God of it. You own it forever, and nobody can really deny that you created it. And so if people can't deny that you created it, they can't really own it and say it's their creation either. So the act of creation inherently binds it eternally to the artist. And they admit this, which is why it's listed there, based on characters by George Lucas. Lots more than characters, based on stories created by George Lucas, universes, everything, right? And so right there, you have the key member, which is George Lucas, the guy who wrote the original screenplay back in 1974 to 75, followed through, wrote and produced the original movie, and then has directed 3 more movies after that, created the stories for every single movie up to that point. That's George Lucas. George Lucas is the key member. The only person I think that's remaining from the original crew besides the actors is John Williams. And John Williams has a big contribution to Star Wars. I don't want to underrate that. But again, when we ended up in kind of those gray fringes, anything without George Lucas, you're missing the core of creation, and they actually admit it by saying it's based on that. Same thing, actually, with James Bond. So I heard that they're turning James Bond into a black woman. Now, people are like, James Bond's going to be a black woman? No. James Bond will never, ever, ever, ever be a black woman. That is a literal impossibility, because James Bond is exactly as Ian Fleming created him to be. He is no different. He is no other person can come in and pervert that creation from him and subvert it. Nobody can do that. It's an impossibility. This is unofficial fiction, and indeed most James Bond movies are unofficial fiction because what do they say on them? Based on 007, created by Ian Fleming. He's no longer, I know he was involved with some of the screenplays and things like that, but he's not part of that. This is unofficial fiction. It's fan fiction. So what's the big difference maybe between, say, Force Awakens and Revenge of the Sith? Right? What's the difference between this one that's absent the creators and this one that has the creators? Or we could even go one step further and say like Rogue One. Rogue One has literally nobody involved in it. No John Williams either. In fact, it has themes by John Williams, based on themes by, it contains music that John Williams wrote, which can't be unwrote. You can't sever the music that he wrote and say it's somebody else's music. It's impossible. You have to give credit where credit's due and say, yeah, I'm using the Star Wars themes by John Williams because they're inherently part of the Star Wars aesthetic. What's the difference between these two? Between this and, say, that Darth Maul fan fiction film on YouTube? Well, is it budget? Well, budget's a big one, right? $200 million is a lot of money to make a movie. It's no more official, though. Well, the big difference is Disney paid George Lucas by buying his company, Lucasfilm. They paid him several $billion for the privilege of suing other people when they want to make unofficial Star Wars movies. So their Star Wars movies are unofficial, just like any other fan-made film. The big difference being that they can sue other people who happen to make them. They have paid for that legal right, but at the heart of it, they still haven't made it their creation. It can't be their creation. It could never be. Now, Force Awakens could be J.J. Abrams' creation, but it can't be Star Wars because it's not George Lucas, and it never will be. They've paid for the privilege to sue people. Or maybe on another level, too, you could say the big difference between Disney Star Wars and fan fiction is that fan fiction is made by fans. Fan fiction is made by people who like Star Wars. And Disney Star Wars is not made by people who like Star Wars. It's made by a corporation. So this brings me to another thing about corporate IP, corporate intellectual property ownership. Can a corporation own artistic creations? And the answer is no, and it's because they're not people. A corporation is not a person. So a corporation cannot create anything. Only people can create things. So only the artists that are employed by the corporation can actually create anything that could be interpreted as art. So the fact that the corporation legally holds the title, the trademark rights to Star Wars, and holds the past copyrights to the past movies, that doesn't change the fact that they still, as a concept, can't create any art. They have to hire artists to do it. They have to hire J.J. Abrams and a fleet of special effects artists and costume artists to create something that they're going to call Star Wars. So at the end of the day, a corporation really can't be viewed as owning anything artistic because it's impossible for it to create art. It must hire actual human beings to do it. And those human beings are done what's called for hire. They do it without any legal ownership over what they're creating at the end of the day, which is very sad. That's kind of like artistic slavery, if you think about it, where you're creating something, you don't own the product of your labors in a metaphysical sense. But I would say that they do, that, J.J. Abrams owns Force Awakens. Whatever I may think about it, it is his creation, and whatever it happens to be based off of or unofficially part of Star Wars, it's still something that is bound up in his artistic vision. So anyway, that's the big concept. Can this be applied to other stuff? Absolutely. So you have Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby created comics. All of these comic book characters that were created by these great artists and writers of the past, they are unofficial at this point. So Thor is not a white woman. Never will be, right? Can't be. Iceman is not gay either, because the people who created these characters have moved on from them. Yes, Marvel is still paying artists to create new things based on characters created by Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby, and Stan Lee. But those things are not official because you can't separate Stan Lee from his creation. Spider-Man will always be as Spider-Man it was when Stan Lee and Steve Ditko made him, when they conjured him out of the abyss and made a story with him. That is how Spider-Man actually is. And so once those guys are no longer attached to it, it's kind of like seeing a band without any original members of Metallica, seeing Metallica with no Metallica members in it. It's maybe, they may be playing Metallica's music, they may be emulating Metallica style, but they can't be Metallica. It's actually an impossibility. Now, the thing is, a lot of people don't view things this way, and I think that's because they've been trained to. They've been trained to think of Spider-Man as some Marvel property, owned by this concept beast called Marvel Comics. Marvel Comics is not a person, so it can't be an artist, and it can't create art. You keep buying things like Batman comics, even though all the creators involved with Batman have long since moved on. It's all unofficial or fan fiction. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. So here's the last thing I'm going to say. It's not bad. Fan fiction is not bad. It's not evil. It's not bad to make unofficial continuations of things, adaptations. But if you were a fan, you should absolutely not accept these as certain or permanent or anything like that. You should be free to not buy things which are unofficial. You shouldn't feel bad when somebody happens to use the finagling of corporate IP ownership to subvert and destroy things that you loved, because the things that you loved cannot be destroyed. Ultimately, that's the thing that you have to remember, is that some company turning James Bond into a black woman doesn't do anything to the original James Bond. It can't. It's an impossibility. You could say, well, this is stupid and not true to the original material, which is absolutely correct. And you can not see the movie and convince other people to not see the movie, which is also a correct thing to do. But you don't have to feel like James Bond has actually been turned into a black woman. He obviously cannot be, because only Ian Fleming could have turned him into a black woman, and Ian Fleming did not do that. So that is something that we could change with our mindset and should push forward on. It starts from things that are very unambiguous, like, say, a band, but it can be applied to almost anything. So Star Wars, Disney Star Wars, it's not canon, guys. It's unofficial. It's fan fiction. View it as such, treat it as such, talk about it as such, including not treating it as anything that needs to be paid attention to or be thought of as official. And anyone that says it is official, they're incorrect, right? Just as they'd be incorrect about Thor being a woman or anything else like that. Once you separate creator and creation, it's completely unofficial. It's a fan work. It's something like that. It'd be like you go see a Dio hologram. You're not seeing Dio, that's obvious. But all of these things are like the Dio hologram. They're just continuations of something which has already passed on from this earth. And that's it. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Something that you can do if you want to is you can buy my books. My books are mine, and I really enjoy writing them. They are an expression of my artistic vision. And I hope you will like them as well. Crown of Sight is technically the latest one, but Voices of the Void is coming out. You could pre-order that right now at Amazon.com. If you're on my mailing list or you jump on my mailing list, you will get that one for free. It's a pretty cool book. It's like Aliens meets Lovecraft, so give it a read. It only takes about 2.5 hours to read it. And let me know what you think by sending me an email. stu@dvspress.com, and let me know what you think. I appreciate the feedback I've gotten so far, including fixing the typos before I start pushing this out to the world. I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you guys next time. Let me know what you think.